On tonight's programme,
there is an argument that if we're going to use the Scottish income tax capacity, we should go for 2 or 3 pence rather than 1.
as Jim Wallace ponders what to do with Liberal Democrat tax policy, a veteran backbencher has a word of advice.
In a sense, the stakes have been raised, because once you raise taxes explicitly, you're making it a clearer statement to the British public that this is about extra spending and extra taxes. It is a gamble.
And after the government's budget tax U-turn, is old Labour back with a bang? Good evening and welcome to this platform special, which has the highlights from the Scottish Liberal Democrat conference, which finished earlier today in Perth. Yesterday, party leader Jim Wallace put his troops on election alert. In his address to conference, he made it clear he will fight next May's Scottish elections on a distinct agenda. The Deputy First Minister knows there is a danger his party will be represented as no more than voting fodder for their larger coalition partners. In a moment, the thoughts of Jim Wallace, but first a look at some of the challenges he faces if he's to keep his party at the heart of devolved government. It was almost 3 years ago that Jim Wallace and Donald Dewar signed the Concordat underpinning Scotland's coalition government. At Perth this weekend, the party leader was keen to stress what he considered to be the achievements of the Liberal Democrats in government.
We have implemented or are implementing more than 70% of the policies in our 1999 manifesto. We do what we say we are going to do.
The real strength of the Liberal Democrat performance in the past 3 years has been that they've managed to attach their names to certain policies, which will be very important going into the next election. Whether or not they're being misleading about this, they've got Liberal Democrat branding on issues of tuition fees and long-term care of the elderly, and they hope to have PR for local government as well. Labour has failed to get its branding on any particular policy.
The verdict of the voters on the current Lib Dem performance will be key to success at the next elections in 2003. All has not been plain sailing. The coalition partners from the outset were on a collision course over tuition fees. Andrew Kuby's report was accepted in part as a compromise between the contradictory Labour and Liberal positions. But can the Lib Dems claim that tuition fees have been abolished?
It's back-ended tuition fees. They've been reduced from 3,000 to 2,000. To the credit, grants did come in, and I think that was partly under pressure from Labour as well, which wanted to see some support for the poorer students. But by no means could you say this is an abolition of tuition fees. And I think, as with the cleverness, turn of phrase that we've seen from Gordon Brown and Tony Blair over their promises on tax last year and what's happened in the past week, I think that the suspicion that the public has for politicians will come to the fore when they try to use this claim that they've abolished tuition fees.
At next year's elections, Jim Wallace will say that free personal care for the elderly, progress towards PR for local government, and a more robust Freedom of Information Act have all been delivered precisely because Liberal Democrats are in government. There is justification for this claim. The question is, though, have they delivered enough? On PR for local government, Mr Wallace was quite clear that the first-past-the-post system was no longer an option.
Everyone here should be taking part in the consultation. Everyone here should be encouraging all those who would benefit from a proper democratic and open system of local council elections to take part in that consultation process. But let us make things absolutely clear. The elections in 2003 must be the last to be fought using the first-past-the-post system.
If Labour doesn't deliver and is absolutely opposed, then our options are either to withdraw from the coalition or to stay in and impose it, put it as the leading thing in our manifesto for the next election, and tell Labour, if after the next election you want a coalition, you've got to agree to PR for local government.
Jim Wallace gave broad hints yesterday that the party will develop a sharper focus on green issues for 2003. But will his party look distinct enough from Labour? This week's budget has seen the government move on to Lib Dem tax and spend ground. That being said, some in the party believe that should not make the Lib Dems afraid to use the Scottish Parliament's tax-varying powers, despite the hike in national insurance that will kick in 1 month before the 2003 elections.
There is an argument that if we're going to use the Scottish income tax capacity, we should go for 2 or 3 pence rather than 1. But is it needed and what is it for? I mean, we'll have to do all the sums and see what we really require. But I think if we're serious about better public services right across the board, they have to be paid for, as we keep saying, and either the existing budget has to be manoeuvred around or we may need some more.
You personally wouldn't run away or be frightened by the prospect of going into the elections next May with the party committed to an agenda of increasing taxation further?
No, I'm an old-fashioned tax and spend liberal, and I make no apologies for that.
If a return to tax and spend was something of an ideological watershed for Labour, then support for private prisons is a major refinement of Lib Dem philosophy. The party is deeply uneasy with this policy, and it is by no means certain that it won't come back to haunt Jim Wallace before the next election.
Now, I recognise and I respect those who feel that only the state should have the role of running prisons. But let me make it clear, whilst the state can delegate the functions of running a prison, I will never let the state delegate its responsibilities to the prisoners sentenced by the courts, be they in the public estate or the private estate.
I think it's up to us who disagree with the policy to pick holes in the figures and to demonstrate that by better cooperation between the public and private sectors, I mean, it may be that the private sector should build a jail and the public sector run it, or other schemes like that. So I think the Parliament as a whole, and certainly the Lib Dems, have to get really stuck into these figures and the assumptions behind them.
The Scottish Liberal Democrats probably have least to worry about ahead of the Scottish general election. Jim Wallace will now repeat mantra-like that Lib Dems make a difference in government and that they do have something distinctive to offer. Holding on to what they currently have in the Scottish Parliament shouldn't be too difficult. But major progress, well, that will take a big boost in their fortunes between now and next May. Well, earlier today I spoke to Jim Wallace and began by asking him why his party welcomed the tax increase for health outlined in the budget, when their case was that funding levels for public services in Scotland were already adequate.
Well, I think the position always must be to start not from a tax position, but one from investment in public services. And I think it is fair to say, and I can say it as a Liberal Democrat, that when Gordon Brown started opening his war chest, as we had long urged him to do, then the additional resources that have come to Scotland in the period of the current spending review, and are now set to come to Scotland as part of the new investment in the health service, then that is considerably greater than would have been raised in 1, 2, I suspect even 3 pence on tax. And it's not a fetish with taxing, it's tried to ensure that there is sufficient resources to go into our public services. Yeah, and if that money is coming from Westminster, and after all, remember, actually a penny on income tax raised at a UK level, because of the Barnett share consequences we get, actually brings more revenue to Scotland than the penny just applying to Scottish taxpayers on their own.
Well, of course, the party's traditionally had a policy of 1p on income tax for investment specifically in education.
Correct.
Charles Kennedy says that that policy still stands. Does it still stand in Scotland?
Well, it's the same policy as we've approached each previous election, and that is a judgment that's made on the eve of the election as to whether we believe that the penny should apply in these circumstances. But the point is, we've said we are prepared to do it if we think that money is needed for the kind of investment in education we want to see. And the contrast between the Liberal Democrat position over successive elections and the Labour position is that we've been prepared to say during these election campaigns, we believe there's an investment in our public services, particularly education, needed. We believe that to pay for that, we should tax. Now, the fact is that Gordon Brown and Tony Blair ran away from that, and I think Charles Kennedy made a very forcible point in his speech on Friday, saying that's a sort of approach that breeds cynicism amongst the electorate.
Sure. But the point is he's making that the federal policy position is still for the 1p increase. The current policy of the Liberal Democrats, unless you decide to change it, is that you still are committed to raising income tax by 1p through the Scottish Parliament.
Yes, that is the policy, but on the eve of the election we'll make a determination as to whether we believe it is necessary or not. We're not going to tax people for the sake of it, and if additional resources are coming from Westminster, and this in fact is what I actually said during the 1999 election campaign, we were actually urging Gordon Brown to open his war chest during that campaign because we believed that he was storing up money there that ought to have been used in funding public services. At the end of the day, that in fact is what happened, and there's no point in putting an additional tax burden on Scottish taxpayers if in fact resources are coming from Westminster.
OK, well, you made the point there about Charles Kennedy's very forceful attack, saying that cynicism is being engendered by parties who do one thing in government when, in fact, there's nothing in their manifesto to suggest that they should be, for example, increasing taxes. By the same principle, you stand condemned also. Where did it say in the Scottish Liberal Democrat manifesto prior to 99 you were committed to building private prisons?
Well, I don't say, where did it say that we weren't? There was actually a section in our manifesto in 1999 which actually looked at the way in which we would seek to, if there was investment needed in the public sector, it did not rule out PFIs, although it was looking for good value for money for the taxpayer.
But let me pick
now, I think where I will accept...
point about Charles Kennedy. He says that it's cynical of politicians to do things in government if they don't have a mandate to do so. You would accept, therefore, you have no mandate to build up to 3 private prisons, do you?
Where I think there is a diversion from our manifesto, and I'll put my hands up and say fair cop, is that we have not managed to reduce prisoner numbers as we
Do you have a mandate for 3 private jails?
As we did not bring down prisoner numbers as we hoped to. Therefore, we are having to build new prisons. We're also having to actually modernise the prison estate.
You have a mandate to do it?
To end slopping out. And it would be irresponsible for any government to actually see that there was the need for further places in our prisons, both because of the because of the Victorian conditions in which many prisoners are there and because of increased numbers. That then led to a conclusion we needed 3 new prisons. Now, our manifesto...
Do you have a mandate to do it?
Our manifesto said that when these capital decisions were required, then we would make an evaluation of what was the best value for the public purse.
I'll just ask one more time. Do you have a mandate to do it?
We are applying the principles we set out in our manifesto to an important capital investment decision.
OK, what about proportional representation for local government? If Labour do not come out in favour of this in September, is this a potential coalition buster?
Well, that's a hypothetical question. We said we would make progress. Indeed, in November, December last year, we set out what the steps would be. These have now been stuck to. There's the white paper that was published last month. It's a white paper. Let's remember, this is the first time I can recall, I think probably the first time ever, that we've got a white paper dealing with local government reform that actually sets out as an option the single transferable vote as a system for proportional representation. We indicated then that the next step would be to have a regard to what comes in the consultation. We will do that in September, but let there be no doubt, I want to see proportional representation for Scotland's local authorities. I believe that is the way we can reinvigorate local democracy. I believe that is the way in which local authorities in Scotland can enjoy parity of esteem with the Scottish Parliament, and I want to make sure that the 2003 local elections are the last fought and first past the post.
And if they're going to be the last fought and first past the post, there is no way, therefore, that Liberal Democrats would be in government after next May unless there was an express commitment to get rid of first past the post.
I'm not going to negotiate any 2003 coalition with you, Bernard, however distinguished you are, but I think the Labour Party should be in no doubt as to the strength of feeling there is within the Liberal Democrats on this issue.
Jim Wallace, thank you very much indeed. At last June's general election, the Liberal Democrats achieved their best results since the 1920s, increasing both their share of the vote and the number of MPs. The party's enhanced performance enabled leader Charles Kennedy to face down many of the persistent critics inside and outside the party who claimed he wasn't up to the challenge of command. Well, Kennedy arrived at this weekend's conference in a noticeably upbeat mood. He used his keynote speech on Friday afternoon to outline his thoughts on a range of domestic and international issues. Our political correspondent Michael Crow watched his address.
It's very warm.
It was an informal speech from Charles Kennedy, both in the manner of delivery and content.
Now, this is not the full Monty you're getting this afternoon. Don't raise your expectations.
In fact, Charles Kennedy was so relaxed it was over 6 minutes before he claimed credit for the Chancellor's rise in health spending.
The budget. This is a very significant week, a seminal week for British politics. Do you know what the most important thing about Gordon Brown's budget and what he, and now today Tony Blair, have been saying about it? It represents the fact that the Liberal Democrats have won the argument on our public services. That's what it means. I really smiled to myself in the Commons chamber on Wednesday afternoon when Gordon Brown was devoting his substantial section to the funding of the National Health Service. And he said, and he outlaid the various options, and he said, whatever option we were to go for, you can't get it for free. And I thought to myself, I could remember every day of the last election, broadcast after broadcast, speech after speech, question after question, interview after interview, saying, people are not stupid, they know you can't get something for nothing. It's just a pity that Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, at the time of the general election, didn't have the courage of our convictions to put that case honestly to the electorate. What a pity that they didn't, because at the last election, we saw part of the malaise that should be worrying to all of us in the political process. People not participating. No wonder people are cynical when they produce a budget before the last general election in which he cuts tax for next year by £3 billion, and their first budget after the general election is the one where they increase tax. Can you blame the voters for feeling cynical about all of us? And I think Blair and Brown alike this week have got a heavy responsibility to bear for adding to that sense of cynicism about the body politic as a whole.
Moving on to foreign policy, he had harsh words for the Israeli government and its treatment of the Palestinians in the West Bank.
The apparent use of force by Israel in some of the settlements on the West Bank is grotesquely disproportionate to the issue that they were seeking to address. We have no time for the insanity which is suicide bombing. But if you just meet that kind of crazed force with excessive force, particularly against innocent men, women and children, you surrender moral legitimacy, you surrender global support, which Israel has hitherto enjoyed, and you make all but impossible a lasting solution resulting from a peace process.
Closer to home, he challenged activists to come up with policy ideas to take the party forward.
Let 1,000 flowers bloom and let's have a good debate. I'm open and receptive to ideas. Genuinely, I'm going round the party trying to stir up dissent as party leader. I think that's part of my responsibility. I think I'd be failing in the task if I didn't. Now, not too much dissent. But what I would say to you is a good, honest, rational, vigorous, intellectual debate is in itself stimulating and will do us no harm whatsoever where our standing and credibility in the country is concerned. And I hope you have...
He finished by hinting to the Labour Party that the price of a coalition after next year's Scottish parliamentary elections could be a third Liberal Democrat cabinet minister. Afterwards, in an interview, I put it to him that if Gordon Brown's budget had proved the Liberal Democrats were right and Labour was now colonising their territory, a vote for the Lib Dems was now redundant.
Oh, I don't think so at all. I lose no sleep over this issue because we've got consistency and we've got credibility. And people are not silly. They remember that Tony Blair and Gordon Brown at the time of the election said that this kind of approach for decent, well-funded, quality public services wasn't the right thing to do. And now, of course, after the election, they're saying the exact opposite. I think what we've got to do is to maintain the basis of consistency and credibility in arguing for the most effective deployment of this money.
You talk about consistency in the light of this budget. Do you still need to put a penny on income tax?
Well, at the moment, our position remains that the penny on income tax pledge is there specifically for education. Now, obviously, not just in the light of the budget, but in a couple of months' time, in the light of the next big event that Gordon Brown unveils, which is the government's overall so-called comprehensive spending review, we will then get a better idea of the projections right through for several years hence. Now, we ourselves, a year out from a general election and a year in front of a Scottish election, are having our own internal review, reassessment of policies. So no hard and fast decisions have been reached, but it's something that will certainly be under consideration.
What about pensioners? They didn't get a great deal out of the budget. Have you just forgotten about them as well? I mean, you just mentioned education there. You didn't mention pensioners.
Oh, certainly not. We still say that a simpler and a more effective way, instead of all these complicated pensioners' credits that Gordon Brown has introduced, and he made a complicated picture even more complicated this week for the budget, better to go for flat rate increases skewed towards older pensioners, available to all. That way the take-up is better and you do more to alleviate pensioner poverty.
Now that Labour's moved into your territory, what is your unique selling point?
First of all, that we were there first. Secondly, will it actually carry credibility with people, given that they've had to turn turtle on so many things that they said in the past? And thirdly, of course, that we have proved ourselves to be straight and honest and upfront with people, where the Labour Party have not, and therefore people, I think, will remember that, provided that we have fresh policies with which to confront and contest future elections.
Well, you said in your speech that you want members to come up with fresh policies, especially in the light of the Scottish parliamentary elections next year. What's your big idea?
I think that the big idea is, first of all, that in some contrast, certainly to the Labour and Conservative parties, on a UK basis, that we do actually welcome internal debate. We don't try and close it down.
What's your big idea? What's your big policy idea?
If you welcome internal debate, you don't then say, and by the way, the big idea is end of debate.
What will you be contributing towards the debate?
Well,
What's your idea?
I've already contributed a great deal since the last general election. I think that there's a big case, for example, to be made for a specified earmarked taxation which goes exclusively to the health service. That's one idea. I think that we need to do a lot more in terms of the environmental agenda in this country. I think we need a lot more in terms of the liberties of the citizen and the individual.
Is building 3 private prisons with private money and run by private companies, a big idea that you support?
I think I don't envy my colleagues in the Scottish Executive or the Scottish Parliament their dilemma here. I strongly support the motivation behind this, which is that we should get rid of Dickensian practices in the year 2002 in Scottish penal policy, end slopping out, for example. But at the same time, with a finite budget, which is still fixed by Westminster, which is where the Liberal Democrats have a role to play in all of this, at, as it were, my level of the party, that fixed budget does not allow for the provision of prison places which can actually make a social impact. What do? Not easy. We're consulting internally, the executive is consulting nationally, but I suspect that the balance of the sentiment will probably prove to be, let's go for social progress, even if this would not have been the preferred solution.
Charles Kennedy, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, that's all from part 1 of this platform special. Join us again in a couple of minutes when we'll hear Labour Minister Douglas Alexander on what Gordon Brown's budget tells us about Labour's second term. And PR for local government, Labour and the Liberal Democrats go head-to-head in debate. And welcome back to this special edition of Platform. It's been described as New Labour's biggest gamble, with a 1% increase in national insurance contributions to fund a massive cash injection into the health service. Chancellor Gordon Brown's budget has decisively ditched the New Labour orthodoxy that you don't tax to spend. He said it was a budget for fairness, but the Conservative opposition have responded by accusing Mr Brown of breaking his election promises. So, what does the government's apparent conversion to tax and spend tell us about the ideological basis of Labour's second term? In a moment, we hear the thoughts of Labour's Minister, Douglas Alexander. But first, our Westminster correspondent, Ray Stewart, has this report.
Gordon Brown's tax and spend pronouncements on Wednesday were perhaps the most ideologically significant since the creation of New Labour. When Tony Blair was elected party leader in 1994, he made it clear that the traditional left-wing view of taxation as a legitimate fiscal instrument to deliver redistribution, equality and better public services was outdated. In short, it was too old Labour.
I don't believe that if you've got a system which is publicly funded, publicly organised, centrally run, one single employer, no choice for the consumer, monopoly organisation, it can conceivably work. So putting more money in just won't produce the kind of changes that Labour wants to see. They put more money in before into lots of public services. It hasn't worked. I don't see why it should work any better now except for the scale.
I think this is New Labour Mark II rather than any return to old Labour. The key difference, I think, here is that old Labour, insofar as we think of Labour governments in earlier periods, were very complacent about the state. They basically believed if you gave public services more money, that would be enough. This government is desperate to reform public services so that when you give them more money, they do actually deliver improvement.
Since winning in 1997, New Labour have stressed that quality public services can only be delivered by affordable increases in spending. The new orthodoxy stressed cutting debt, keeping inflation under control and, crucially, only funding extra spending from economic growth. Tax rises were strictly out.
For the Labour Party to say it's going to raise taxes and for it to put out figures that show it'll raise taxes for Parliament after Parliament, that's a very big change to the way that Tony Blair presented himself for many years. It's a change to how he ran at the last election. So they've bet an awful lot on it, and I think people will look at the Labour Party differently now to the way that they looked at them the day before yesterday.
Wednesday was something of a watershed. Labour have, in effect, conceded that the Liberal Democrats and old Labour warriors like Roy Hattersley have had a point about taxation all along. But the new strategy, deliberately timed to come out at the beginning of Labour's second term, is not without risk. What happens if the tax increases fail to deliver what they're supposed to?
I think both parties took a risk. The Labour Party took a risk that all their money would work. People will be very angry to pay the money out if and only if it doesn't work. The Tories took the gamble that it won't work and that they can come and think of an alternative system that people will like better. So both parties made a big gamble. That's why it was a very important day.
In a sense, the stakes have been raised, because once you raise taxes explicitly, you're making it a clearer statement to the British public that this is about extra spending and extra taxes. It is a gamble.
Here at Westminster, the Tories have noticeably perked up in the last week. They've been in the doldrums after 2 successive thrashings in the polls. So, for the first time in a long time, they believe that the political agenda has moved on to ground they can exploit. Over the next few months, expect to hear the Conservatives claim that they are the party of sound public services and low taxation. The clear blue water between the big two may finally be here.
It's both potentially a big gift to the Conservatives, but it's also a big challenge. If Gordon Brown manages to improve the National Health Service, if the Conservative Party cannot come up with good alternatives, then it could be Gordon Brown that wins out of this budget, but it's certainly a gamble and the Conservatives could be the gainer.
Potentially, the Tories could benefit from this, because with the political stakes raised by higher taxes, the Tory party it looks to be in a better position to say, we have an alternative, we wouldn't spend this money, we wouldn't have, now they are saying, the NHS in this form. And in that sense, I think the Tory party thinks it may have a chance here.
Margaret Thatcher was the first ideological Conservative leader, rolling back the frontiers of the state, allowing lame duck industries to die, cutting tax and presiding over privatisation and deregulation. But post-Thatcher, the Tories seem to have lost their way philosophically. The challenge for Ian Duncan Smith is to make his party relevant in an age when the right won the economic argument, but the left won the social argument.
I don't think it's just the budget that makes the ideological division between the parties clearer. It's also the Conservatives' statement now that they would not retain the National Health Service in its current universal tax-funded form, that they would go for some sort of private or social insurance system. They haven't been clear on the details, but they have done what Margaret Thatcher in all her years never did, which was to say we will dismantle this structure of the NHS. So I think it's both parties have made the ideological division clearer. And in a sense, the British public does have a much clearer choice to make now.
In the last decade, the consensus-driven managerial policies of John Major and the what matters is what works third-wave vision of Tony Blair have somewhat blurred the traditional left-right divide in British politics. This week, that came to an end. No more will economic policy be fought on the same ground. This week might just be the week that saw the rebirth of ideology.
I'm now joined in the studio by Trade and Industry Minister Douglas Alexander, the man who coordinated last year's successful Labour general election campaign, and who, of course, was previously an advisor to Gordon Brown. Douglas Alexander, since 1994, Tony Blair has always made the point that you have to get folk to trust you. How can people now take that claim seriously when in the budget this week, Labour did something which they didn't promise to do at the election last year?
Because what was announced in that budget was we've got the highest growth of any country in the G8. We've got record low inflation, record low interest rates. We've created more than 1 million more jobs since 1997. And we are moving forward an agenda that says we need to fund our public services. What was the final week of our campaign in 2001? It was the message, we will put schools and hospitals first, over a Conservative Party determined to have indiscriminate tax cuts that would imperil public services.
I'm not going to quibble with any of that. You did say that you were going to put public services at the top of the agenda. What you didn't say in that election campaign was that you were going to increase national insurance. Now, how can you claim to be a party that deserves the trust of the people when you do something that you didn't promise to do in an election campaign?
Well, I suppose because I coordinated the campaign, I have the virtue of having sat in probably too many Millbank press conferences in which the Labour leadership were challenged specifically on the point of the commitments we made on taxation. We were very clear that we would not raise the basic or the top rate of income tax. However, when we were challenged on national insurance, it was made clear by many Labour spokespeople that we weren't in a position to exclude the possibility of raising taxes right across the board. Because
so the
you can't
strategy
ask,
was just sleekitness when it comes to national
No,
insurance?
I think it's important to send a clear signal about your intentions, and what I would say is that you've got to understand what happened last week as a continuum. The first thing we did in 1997 was to establish a platform of stability. We took very tough decisions for those first 2 years in order to get stability into the public finances. We then massively reallocated resource within the public sector, and thirdly, we enjoyed the benefits of growth by achieving a steady level of growth in the British economy. We've now recognised that there is a further demand within the National Health Service in particular for additional funding if we've to meet the aspirations which I believe are shared not just by people in Scotland but by people right across the United Kingdom.
Okay, but what do you say to a voter who has perhaps voted Labour since Tony Blair became the leader, who in a sense bought into New Labour as a party that wasn't an old-style state socialist party, who says the very reason that I vote New Labour is that because I believe the kind of things that Mr Blair was saying all along. But what's happened this week is that they've in fact just reverted to old Labour policies, and they've done it in a way which is sleek it because they didn't tell us at the elections last year that they were going to do
With
this.
respect, Bernard, that's nonsense. I mean, what did the Chancellor say last week? He said this is a budget for enterprise and fairness. We saw cuts in the corporation tax rate for small businesses. We saw additional help in terms of VAT for small businesses. One of the reasons that this party is fundamentally different from the party 10 or 15 years ago is because we're not just interested in a politics of distribution, but a politics of production. We recognise how important it is to have an economy that is generating growth, generating jobs, lowering poverty as a result of that, and funding our public services. And don't take my word for it, take the word of Dennis Skinner at the last meeting of the Parliamentary Labour Party. He said in response to the Prime Minister, "Aye, Tony, I suppose you're right. You can't have socialism if you're skint."
Okay, and we now know that as a result of the budget that the percentage of national income that will be spent on health in 5 or 6 years' time will be up over 9%. Nobody doubts that it's a massive amount of money. But what you've said and what the Prime Minister was saying, you can't get something for nothing. So shouldn't you be honest here and say, well, in actual fact, the Liberal Democrats, in their analysis, and the SNP in the context of the Scottish Parliament elections in 1999, did actually get it right, because the challenge, in a sense, which you have taken up, is a challenge which they have thrown down to the voters
because
before.
there is a very fundamental difference between the Labour Party's approach and the approach of either of those two parties. And if you look at the election campaign that we ran in 2001, it reflected that insight. It was for the first 10 days of the campaign, we ran on a message of the importance of economic stability, the instability inherent in the nationalist policies, and the instability inherent in the fact that nobody believes the Liberal Democrats could run the economy, I actually believe is reflective of a fundamental difference. We believe, first of all, you strengthen the economy, and on that strong foundation, you strengthen public services. Neither of those other parties could make that claim credibly.
There is actually one big difference between what you've done and what the Liberal Democrats and the SNP do, and that is that the SNP and the Liberal Democrats actually put it into an election manifesto.
But as I say, the starting point for us is not as a knee-jerk reaction we want to raise taxes. Let me take you back to 1993. Gordon Brown was appointed the Shadow Chancellor, and he gave a major speech in which he set out what would be the priorities, and his actual principles in terms of taxation. He said, first of all, that we don't tax for its own sake, we tax for a purpose. Secondly, that purpose should be clear to the public. And thirdly, that the tax should be fair. Now, on that basis, what we announced last week is entirely consistent with those principles articulated almost a decade ago.
Let me ask you what you think it means for wider British politics, because in a sense the Conservatives have been groping around for an issue in which they can carve themselves out a niche and a distinctive political identity. Isn't the fact that you have now given them that niche, you've given them this identity, and that there are risks inherent in this politically and electorally?
Well, I take a perhaps unorthodox view on this. I think the biggest gamble last week was taken by the Tory party, because actually the choice that they made was that they would accept that there is a consensus right across the House of Commons, indeed right across Britain, on the need to raise the amount of money that we spend on health services. But in fact, they've decided not to fund the National Health Service, breaking a consensus that's lasted more than 50 years. In reality, their position is now either that you pay for the operation, or you pay to visit the GP, or you have a form of insurance. Now, that to me seems an extraordinary ideological position for a party trying to secure victory at an election.
Douglas Alexander, thanks very much indeed for joining us this evening. Well, there are few subjects that capture the imagination of Liberal Democrats more than proportional representation. And this morning, the issue of voting reform for local government took centre stage in the conference hall with a well-attended debate. Electoral reform is an article of faith for Liberal Democrats, and one leading MSP today declared PR for local government to be a non-negotiable policy. But with opposition to PR still widespread in Labour ranks, there are testing times ahead for Scotland's governing Lib Lab coalition. In a moment, the two sides of the argument debate the issue. But first, Robin Gray has this report.
As conference delegates gathered in Perth this weekend, some might have seemed a little battle-weary. Their campaign to cajole their Labour partners into reforming council elections has been something of a war of attrition. First came the Macintosh report, which supported the party's call for PR. Then another report, this time from Richard Kerley's working group, backed the Lib Dems' recommendation for the single transferable vote, known as STV, where electors mark candidates in order of preference. But opposition in Labour ranks to changing the status quo is deeply entrenched, and progress has been slow. Last month, the executive launched a much-awaited white paper on the issue, committing ministers to an announcement of their intentions in September. But whilst bringing in PR is top of the party's wish list, actually implementing it could pose more than a few practical problems in areas where the Lib Dems and Labour are less willing to do business than they are at Holyrood. Eastern Bartonshire Council is a classic example. Here, the Liberal Democrats and Labour before them have chosen to go into minority administrations rather than coalition with one another. Given the coalition's an almost inevitable consequence of proportional representation, could councils characterised by single parties jealously guarding power realistically bury the hatchet and work together? The leader of the Labour group here says the Lib Dems' record undermines their support for the power sharing that would come about if PR was to be implemented.
I think this must be the most undemocratic council in the whole of Scotland. We, the Labour Party in Eastern Bartonshire, are the largest party. We've got the most councillors, but we hold the fewest positions, we have the least power, and what you have is the party that has one less councillor than us actually in power, the administration, Liberal Democrat group, and then you've got a Tory group who only have 3 councillors, and they're the ones that really govern what's going on within this council, although they are not, they keep on stressing, in coalition.
But the Lib Dem leader of the council concedes that changing the voting system would mean parties would finally have to do business, and that might be no bad thing.
What we do is fight by the rules of first past the post, and we've done very well by it. But for Scotland as a whole, I think PR, and I think the SDP form, which would hold the link to the people, to the community, would be good news.
Notwithstanding the potential complications on the ground, proportional representation and how to achieve it was one of the most common conversation topics at conference. The last item on the conference agenda here in Perth was a debate on proportional representation. Many activists stayed on to take part, determined as they were to send a message to the party leadership and to Scottish Labour that a commitment to implementing PR must be forthcoming in September if the Liberal Democrats are to play any further part in coalition. Two of the party's backbench MSPs tapped into the prevailing mood and tried to put the grassroots at ease with some tough talking.
I believe that we've got to send a clear message to our coalition colleagues in the Labour Party. Reforming local government with a fair voting system is not negotiable. You can't decouple both either. I, for one, have to say, wouldn't support a future coalition with the Labour Party if they block this reform, and I hope you wouldn't either.
We should not underestimate the importance of actually having a government white paper published which puts the case for a single transferable vote. And the status quo is not an option. Let's just say to those who support first past the post from this conference today, your days are numbered.
With ministers due to announce their proposals in September, perhaps the end is finally in sight for the Liberal Democrats, although Scottish Labour are unlikely to give up without a fight.
Well, to debate the vexed issue of PR for local government, I'm now joined in the studio by two leading members of East Bartonshire Council. From the Liberal Democrats, John Morrison, and from Labour, Stephen Bailey. John Morrison, is it negotiable?
No, Bernard, I don't think it is. One thing that we are absolutely committed to is the issue of proportional representation. And in councils up and down the land, Liberal Democrats actually do very well out of the first past the post system. So we are not in this for ourselves. We're in this because we believe in proportional elections because that's a better way of delivering democracy in this country.
Stephen Bailey, it's non-negotiable according to the Liberal Democrats. Clearly the coalition will not continue either before the election or immediately after the election unless Labour give ground in this. Surely the bigger picture thing here is what's important. Why don't you just concede it?
I think the difficulty is that if you're saying it's non-negotiable, why have the consultation document that's been sent out? We don't know the message that's going to come back from the people in Scotland. And if I could refer back to the campaign that took place prior to local government reorganisation previously, the government consulted at that time. It clearly did not listen to what was being said by the people, and it then went ahead with local government reorganisation. I think what has to happen now is that a clear message must be given by the people of Scotland to the consultation document, and we take it from there.
Well, it's quite clear that when Jack McConnell was up for re-election as First Minister, that we got some cast iron assurances that progress would be made. It's in the partnership agreement between the coalition parties, and we're making good progress towards it. This white paper is a step in that process, but what is quite clear and what is absolutely fundamental is that the local elections which are fought on the 1st of May 2003 must be the last under the first past the post system.
Stephen Bailey, you were saying there that you have to listen to what the consultation system actually says, but the first report that went to the Scottish Parliament was the Mackintosh Committee report. It consulted. Kelly then had a widespread consultation. Both of these bodies have recommended proportional representation. Isn't the fundamental issue here is that McConnell knows the majority of Labour activists are against this reform and he's just playing for time?
I don't think that is the case. I think that a large number of Labour activists are in favour of reform. However, as you will be aware, there is a large debate taking place within the Labour Party at present. I think that the system that was brought in for the Scottish Parliament elections was one that saw a large increase in the number of women represented, and I think that if any change has to come about in local government voting systems, what we need to do is ensure that more women are represented, more ethnic minorities are represented, and in particular more young people are there. Local government should be a breeding ground for politicians, not a retirement home.
John Morrison, the reform of the electoral system will make the kind of cooperative politics which we see at Holyrood a reality also in many more councils. Now, Labour and the Liberal Democrats run Scotland. Why can't you run East Bartonshire together?
I think there is a clear distinction to be made between the parliamentary situation and the local government situation. What the Labour Party and local government have had almost unbroken for the last 50 years is untrammelled power, and they therefore have come to the view that they can use power as they wish. We can see that in councils like North Lanarkshire, South Lanarkshire and other similar council chambers across the country. What we want to actually see is a balanced council like Eastern Bartonshire in many more council chambers across the country, because that means that there is strong opposition, that there is a much more clearly defined view from administrations that they've got to get things right, and that's a sort of future which will deliver a much more democratic Scotland in 2007.
Stephen Bailey, do you expect Jack McConnell as First Minister to be bound by the results of the consultation process within the Labour Party? Because having spoken to very many people in constituencies, there is no doubt that the overwhelming majority of members of the Labour Party are against PR for local government. So should he heed the message that will be sent from activists?
I think he needs to heed the message that's been sent from activists and also from the wider community. This consultation exercise is not just a Labour Party consultation exercise, it's amongst the whole of the various different the various political parties in Scotland, the various different voluntary organisations, private sector. This is not simply a Labour Party consultation exercise. If I could just pick up a point that John's made about running Eastern Bartonshire Council, the Liberal Democrats got 27% of the vote in the 1999 elections. I fail to see how that is a democratic response that they now control the council.
Good argument for PR?
I don't think so, because the system might change. I don't understand the reason why the Liberal Democrats decided to try and go alone in Eastern Bartonshire, when clearly, at time after time, myself and my colleagues wished to sit down with the Liberals and talk to them about running Eastern Bartonshire as a joint administration.
That was not the experience of Eastern Bartonshire councillors in the time when Labour were in majority control. They ran the place as their fiefdom. They weren't interested in talking. They're now actually finding themselves in opposition and wondering what on earth it's all about. If we get PR, then the Labour Party will have to rethink the whole business of local government in Scotland in a much more democratic forum.
And if you get it, you might have to sit down and hold hands. Thanks very much indeed for joining us this evening. Well, it's fair to say that the Liberal Democrats didn't exactly get some of the press coverage they were looking for from this morning's newspapers. Judging by today's reports, it seems that many of the journalists attending conference were more interested in a bizarre turf war which flared up between the party and a large group of stamp collectors who found themselves sharing Perth's Jewers Centre this weekend. Tensions quickly mounted, with the stamp collectors accusing the politicians of muscling in on their space and pestering them for conference passes. Well, to analyse events from the Liberal Democrat conference in Perth and Gordon Brown's budget statement at Westminster, I'm now joined in the studio by Angus MacLeod, Scottish political correspondent of The Times, and in Edinburgh is Colin Mackay, political editor of Scottish Radio Holdings. Angus, the budget, a defining moment in politics?
Defining moment in the sense that Brown eventually got up there and at the dispatch box announced that money was being raised, through a form of tax to spend on public services. OK, I accept that is a defining moment. But what I don't accept is all this talk about, old Labour alive again. I mean, a tax, if that is what it was, and NI contributions, which starts at 4,500, can hardly be described as socialism red in tooth and claw. And I think that, that what would have differentiated and defined it as an old Labour budget would have been, a revival of the higher tax rate, the 50% rate. Fair enough. That would have been, definitely old Labour alive again. But I don't think that budget quite qualifies as it.
Colin, turning to the Liberal Democrats, they might be a major player in government here. Did the conference have the feel of a party that was at the heart of Scottish government?
Anything but. It was a small-time conference, and it was a fairly small-town conference. In fact, they were licked by the stamp collectors who were having their conference next door. There were 3 times as many people turned up to the philatelist than turned up to the Liberal Democrats. And one of the things that showed how small it was that they were actually being lobbied by the prison officers and the prison officers' wives because of the Prison Estates Review and the privatisation proposals that are being pushed forward by Jim Wallace. And they were pleased that they were being lobbied by these people whose livelihoods and whose homes are being threatened, and they were actually pleased because they've never been lobbied at their conference before, and they thought that they had finally arrived because they were being lobbied.
Angus, Charles Kennedy's speech was pretty relaxed, the jacket was off, all that sort of stuff, but was it effective?
Well, I think it was effective, and it showed us that he's probably lost his punch, and to that extent, well done, Charles. But of course, as this this new habit that they're all forming. I mean, Tony Blair started it, Ian Duncan Smith's done it, John Major did it. I remember being at a Tory conference, John Major looked terribly uncomfortable with his jacket off. So, looking at it as a performance, Kennedy's always very easy to listen to. You know, you could sit there and listen to Kennedy for a very long time, but that's a different thing from asking, was this a performance where there was a lot of meat? You know, we were left asking, actually, just as about Charlie himself, where's the beef?
Colin, Jim Wallace, number of challenges ahead. First of all, delivering this PR commitment for local government, and secondly, having a more distinctive terrain ahead of the elections in 2003. How is he going to achieve this?
Well, I'm not sure he's going to achieve it all, certainly. I think he probably will achieve PR in some shape or form. And, you know, he was very resolute in his conference speech, one of the strongest lines in his conference speech, where he said that the 2003 council election will be the last one by first past the post. And he's probably right there. I don't know how they're going to change it. I don't think they know how they're going to change it. And I think they've got a lot of negotiations with Labour to come. And I don't think they're going to get a deal finalised before the next election. I think that's going to be the peg that the next coalition talks will probably hang on after the next year's election. On the policy front, I think he's got a lot of work to do. His speech was very tired in terms of policy. He was talking about environmental things that Henry McLeish actually announced when he was First Minister more than a year ago. He was talking about things like the Borders Railway. Now, the Lib Dems have had the MPs and the MSPs in the Borders for as long as I can remember, and yet there's no further forward in terms of a Borders Railway. They're talking about things that they don't know where they're going to get the money from, and I think they've got a lot of work to do over the next year. And I think that's why Jim Wallace has actually hired a new policy guru to try and help him in the Scottish Executive to come up with something to have to say in that election.
Briefly, Angus, can they look forward with confidence?
Well, I think they need a big idea, and they need it very quickly. I think, as far as PR is concerned, I think they've boxed themselves in. I think the whole of PR hangs on what Labour do now.
Angus and Colin, thanks very much indeed for joining us this evening. Well, that's all from this platform special. We're back later this week at our regular Thursday evening slot of 11 o'clock. So until then, from everyone on the platform production team, goodbye.